You're listening to Innovators, the podcast from Harris Search Associates, where we speak with global leaders in education, research, engineering, and the health sciences, and ask them to share lessons learned as they continue to advance the frontiers of innovation and discovery. Today's podcast will be led by Rick Skinner, Senior Consultant.
We live in interesting times. Recent reports of a major data breach, T-Mobile, carry with them a certain irony. The company and its customers, past and present, are rightly concerned at the unauthorized access to personal information of 54 million people, including nearly 8 million current postpaid customers. Compromised were name, date of birth, social security number, and driver's license ID information, as well as phone numbers. That some of this information was already publicly available did not mitigate concerns of T-Mobile or the persons who were affected. The irony of the data breach is that the actual communications content of millions of persons who were T-Mobile users were already in possession of federal agencies. Since shortly after 9/11, what our guest and a colleague termed the bulk collection of private sector information by government security organizations was standard practice, at least until Edward Snowden's revelations exposed that practice. Two postscripts to Mr. Snowden. The first is that Snowden was not an employee of the National Security Agency, but rather a contractor hired by the consulting firm Booz Allen Hamilton, suggesting just how complex the making and doing of cybersecurity has become, what with private firms directly involved in the work of government intelligence agencies via contractors. And the second note is that 7 years after the Snowden's leak, a U.S. district court ruled in the case of United States versus Mullen that the federal government's mass surveillance programs leaked by Snowden was illegal and possibly unconstitutional. The law and the Constitution trumped national security, at least in this case. But cybersecurity has lost none of its salience or importance. Indeed, the Snowden leaks and the resultant court judgment only added to the already formidable challenge of securing the United States from cyber attacks targeted by a growing number of state and non-state actors, as well as mixes of the two. We want to touch on three dimensions of the challenge. The challenge of a cybersecurity strategy that somehow integrates and articulates the respective roles of the agencies charged with formal responsibility for securing the country and bridges to the assets and vulnerabilities of states and local governments, public utilities, and key industries, all within the constraints of the American form of government and the rights of individuals. Then there's the challenge of cybersecurity policy. It provides clear guidance to all stakeholders and provides both goals and boundaries which inform stakeholders and provide general standards by which the promulgation and exercise of policy can be held accountable. And third, the challenge of cybersecurity personnel, and more specifically, leadership, who have the general technical know-how, a strategic perspective, and sensitivity to the delicate balance, never finally reached but always being sought, between security needs and legal constitutional constraints. Our guest on Innovators today is a person with fingers in all sorts of domains and therefore ever ready to take on the knotty issues of cybersecurity. Fred Cate is the distinguished and Dutton Professor of Law and Vice President for Research at Indiana University. A graduate of Stanford and Stanford Law School, he is living proof that a good mind does not go wasted. I tried to count the number of institutional, state, national, and international boards of directors, advisors, and governors he was appointed to and lost count and gave up. But it is also the range of his expertise and advice that also impresses. Microsoft, the Institute of Advanced Studies, law firms, the U.S. Department of Defense, the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the National Academy of Sciences, and the 2008 Barack Obama presidential campaign, to mention the names of but a sample to which he has given time and advice. Welcome, Professor Cate, to Innovators. In a TED Talk you gave on data privacy and data control, you made the point that something will always go wrong. And you were talking then about the consent we give to entities that are stewards of our personal information. Invariably, you said there is a breach or our data are used in ways in which we did not agree and so forth and so on. But in the realm of cybersecurity at, say, a national level, something goes wrong. And the question that raises is to what extent the fault to paraphrase Caesar, lies not in the stars, but in national strategy. Now, the architecture of cybersecurity rests on some sort of worldview of what is to be protected from what sorts of attacks, from what sorts of adversaries. And I could make the case, I think, that the United States might well have been ready for a terrorist attack against itself that arose from another nation state in 1993 when the World Trade Center was bombed. But the problem was the 7 instigators came from Pakistan, Egypt, Iraq, Palestine, and Kuwait, and that the attack was masterminded by an Egyptian cleric who lived for some time in Jersey City, New Jersey, a hotbed of something, I imagine. The group was bound to one another, not by their nationality, but their faith in a radical Islamic vision of the world. So what are the strategic elements of cybersecurity? How do you contend with blind spots that are rooted in some shared sense of how an adversary or a hacker operates? And for that matter, what do you advise organizations to do when they construct a strategy of cybersecurity that accepts the premise you say we should, which is something always goes wrong?
A great set of questions there. So let me say one thing is cybersecurity benefits a lot from humility. And if you start out saying, I know not everything's going to go well, you're going to do a lot better than if you think you're guarding against everything. Because many people say, cybersecurity is all asymmetric. It is the definition of asymmetric warfare. The good guys have to win every battle. The bad guys only have to win one to get in your network. And so one thing I really advise is real humility, just recognizing. Another is recognizing that you're in a running firefight. The ground is changing as you move. The strategies are changing. And one challenge we've had in a lot of cybersecurity is we're always protected against yesterday's attack. And by the way, we do the same thing in other forms of security as well. We're always guarding against yesterday's attack. So we've spent, millions and millions of dollars hardening airplanes and making airports harder to get into because we're guarding against the attack that happened 20 years ago. But the game, of course, is to go where the hockey puck's gonna be, not where it is now, and certainly not where it was 20 years ago. So I think for cybersecurity, that really means paying attention to the new types of attacks we're seeing. Almost always they start small before they get big. And a good example would be ransomware. We saw ransomware for a decade. Nobody paid much attention to it until it brought down a pipeline and a meatpacking plant and started becoming a major issue. So you got to pay attention to the early signals. I mean, this is an intelligence game. And then the third and last thing I would say is be prepared for something to go wrong. And so that may mean having a more inclusive strategy, not just a perimeter, not just keeping bad guys out. You got to control them once they give in. Don't privilege everyone. Don't let everyone run their machines as administrators. Don't give everyone access to everything. Use good backups. Have appropriate recovery systems. Do you have a telephone list so you can call your people if your network comes down? These are like really practical things. These are the sorts of things we tell parents with like kindergarten kids about preparing for emergency, but they still work well 40 years later. You really have to accept the bad things are just going to happen. And then the question is, how little damage will it cause? How little might it cost you? How much can you contain the fallout so that you keep able to run your business or run your government agency or run your university? And I think that strategy is a change we're starting to see people make, but a lot of people are still in the perimeter strategy. If I can just build a higher wall, I'll be safer.
We're talking today, just in the few days after the anniversary, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and watching the various programs that came on about it. What was most striking was this sense on the part of many, especially in the administration at the time, that they could not afford another strike. That could not happen again. And as a result, they took measures that I don't know that any of them would rethink it, but I think at the time they felt compelled to take actions that they might not otherwise have because they knew, or at least they believed, that something could not go wrong again. Humility. I've written that down in big letters. Some years back, Michael Lipset argued that there is policy, and then there is what actually is done in the name of policy. And he contended that the space between the two could be Grand Canyon almost. In your post of Vice President for Research at Indiana University, you likely have abundant research underway that involves human subjects in the collection, maintenance, and analysis of the information from and about those people. By dint of your job, and I sound like I'm lecturing you, but you have institutional responsibility for seeing to it that that information is secure, in part by having researchers trained in the use of such data. Now, I don't think I'm going to shock you when I share my experience and knowledge of how various research organizations implement the policy on human subjects in research. It varies considerably. Is that variance the price of sponsoring or just doing research? Is that just part of the business? Or is that lack of a more prescriptive policy that governs the research and perhaps reduce the variance? But let me go a step further. Put bigger than that, more broadly, is the world of cybersecurity one in which policy is formulated as directed by strategy and in terms that accept a degree of variance as a practical matter that something will go wrong, that can often be tracked back to practice falling within that range of variance? In other words, the very things you prepared for happen, and that is permitted by policy. So I guess I'm asking a broader question. How does strategy really drive policy?
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, it presumes that there's strategy, which we see a lot of cybersecurity efforts that don't appear to be motivated by any strategy. They're just reactive, or they're throwing everything at the wall and sort of seeing what sticks. And then you're assuming there's policy, which is not always the case either. Sometimes you will have an organization really pursuing cybersecurity, but without a clear set of policies for what it's doing, how much will it tolerate variance, and so forth. I would say variance is inevitable, and you want to allow room for it, because remember, we need cybersecurity in everything we do. Our light switches, our doorbells at home that have cameras, our cars, our planes, and so we're not going to write rules or policies that are going to lock down everything. There's going to always have to be room for human discretion and for human judgment. But I think there are things you can do to try to guide that. I think the same thing would be true, by the way, in the human subjects environment. Again, we can't tell researchers everything they should do. We can give them clear guardrails, give them a clear objective, and then monitor them as they're doing it so that we, if you will, audit. And that's another thing we don't do that often with cybersecurity. So we spend millions, we'll launch all sorts of new initiatives, and then we don't go back and do, if you will, an after action report and say, how's that working? Are we actually deterring attacks? Do we see an effectiveness level? We don't even compare data across institutions. So right now, there is no mandatory reporting in really any industry in the country outside of healthcare under the HIPAA security rule and a few highly regulated areas like classified information. So you can have 10 banks in a row, one gets hit by a cyber attack, the other 9 don't even know about it. Better information sharing, and then better looking at what's happening to your neighbor and what's happening internally to you. And that way you don't get caught out. You don't keep doing the same thing for 10 years and then discover the attackers have gone around you and they've got something entirely new and different they're doing.
I want to follow up on that. You said something that I really was struck by, that many organizations implement cybersecurity practices and policies. But then there's either not an audit, but there is no comparison. That is, peers do not go to peers. You don't go to Iowa State and say, let's compare how we do things. Is that because in some ways that's almost a contradiction in terms for some organizations? This is supposed to be about secure information. Why in God's name would I possibly share that with anybody? Or is that simply the fact that we build systems without recognizing the logic of failure, to use a very famous old book a couple of years ago? Which is it? I mean, is it because we don't think we can share information easily or readily? Or it's just part and parcel of the business of saying, oh, it'll work. We spent a lot of time and effort and money on this, so it's got to work.
Well, it's both, and it's probably even more than that. Oftentimes we embark on something either because, again, it's closing the barn door after the horse has left. So we saw what happened, so let's protect against that attack again. But maybe that's not the attack we should be worried about. We don't share data in large part, but frankly, there's no legal obligation to. There's a lot of sensitivity around data. I mean, do you really want to tell the world that you've been hacked or you've been attacked or you've lost customer data? And if it weren't for state breach notification laws that require that we notify individuals if their data has been lost, we wouldn't know anything. Frankly, our knowledge base would be close to zero. And even that is only if it's been exposed. So if it's just ransomware, if it's just been locked down in your system, you don't have to tell the consumer that. And so again, we don't have good numbers on ransomware.
I'm sorry, but it sounds as though it's a case of if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, well, then you didn't have a hack. You weren't hacked. So you don't tell anyone and there's no obligation. So I guess my question for is, how long can that be sustained? Especially when you talk about, as you pointed out earlier, we're going to have security for everything from light switches to the transmissions in our car. How long can you hold out against, one, an obligation to report, and two, I would say almost the necessity of comparing different approaches to ensuring cybersecurity?
I think a lot of industry will hold out until Congress makes them disclose. So we see informal sharing. In other words, if you're the chief security officer of a bank and I'm the chief security officer of a bank, and we were probably FBI agents together before working side by side, we might share data in that way. But it's not getting shared in any institutional way. It's not getting shared in a research way. It's not getting shared in the Department of Justice could not tell you today how many actual breaches there are. And in fact, the FBI will tell you they think for everyone that's publicly reported, there are probably 9 that are not public.
Good Lord.
So we are all guessing. And then we don't know if we're seeing the tip of the iceberg or are we seeing the base of the iceberg? In other words, are the other attacks worse? Are they less bad? Again, lots of anecdotal and informal sharing, but very high reluctance to want to share at an institutional level.
Now that's interesting because in a way it sort of bridges to my next question for you. You've been involved in a lot of discussions about identity and identity management. And for some time, the solution to this challenge of making certain, in the words of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, the right person and things have the right access to the right sources at the right time. And the answer seemed to be some sort of biometrics, fingerprints, face, voice, DNA, and so forth. Increasingly, however, the persons seeking access to information are not persons, but automated agents. They're bots, they're devices that transmit and receive data, pacemakers for hearts. And they seek out recondite information more or less autonomously. There's nothing guided them per se, although increasingly they're guided by artificial intelligence and algorithms. Now, in a virtual world, is it time to give up on the holy grail of biometrics and look elsewhere? Because it's hard for me to imagine a world in which all 5 or 7 billion of us are all trying to find out a lot about each other versus all of these devices that are going to be communicating with one another and doing so more or less autonomously and based on some sort of automatic way of doing things. So it's not people we're worrying about so much, it's things.
Yeah, so again, a fabulous question and a subject we could discuss the rest of the day. I mean, one of the things we see, particularly with the advent of artificial intelligence, is this rapidly expanding use of machine originating cyber attacks. So not just like I set code loose in the wild and see who it attacks, but rather I use maybe a botnet, I use a bevy of machines using artificial intelligence to then come up with more and creative ways to attack you or attack your business or attack your employees. We're not going to take people out of that equation. In other words, even when we think about just machine to machine interactions, usually a person authenticated that to start with. So like I signed up for an account, I told my bank that this was my computer. Now my bank may talk to my computer without me, but I vouched for it to start with. So the bank still needed to know who I was. And I think biometrics are going to play an important role in that, probably more important than they're playing today, but not perfect, because of course biometrics are not perfect. This comes back to the point of humility. Nothing's going to be an absolute protection here. One things we see is everyone's gone to phones now as a form of authentication. And that's good. I mean, that means you're not going to have Russians attacking remotely because they don't have access to your phone. On the other hand, phones aren't perfect. We know there are lots of problems with phones, including the fact that we now are prompting people so many times a day to click yes, that people would click yes even on fraudulent attempts. They just assume it's them trying to do it. We're going to learn that no tool is going to be the perfect tool here. And so maybe one corollary of humility, where we started, is thinking about layers of security so that, in some settings, 2 or 3 might be appropriate. In some settings, you may want 8 or 9 to be appropriate. Depends on how confidential the information is or how important the system is you're guarding access to. Biometrics are clearly going to be part of that layer. Devices are going to be part of that layer. AI is going to be part of that layer because AI can spot anomalies. It can recognize, like, I go home every day and I check my whatever bank account. And so it will recognize that pattern faster than any human will. And so that would know then when something's out of the ordinary, but you don't want all your eggs in one basket here at all.
Well, and that's a great segue to my last question, and it has to do with, I guess, stereotypes. Almost anybody involved in information technology and cybersecurity, yourself included, have long borne the sobriquets of being a geek or a nerd, and they were often the butt of Saturday Night Live skits and so forth, some of which were funny sometimes. But you don't fit that mold. I'm sorry, Fred. You don't quite make it all the way, because indeed you are that rarest of things, a lawyer with a sense of humor, which somebody said when I mentioned that I was talking to you, they said, no lawyer has a sense of humor. So evidence your TED Talks, and those are some great ones. And the fact that you somehow managed to talk without invoking acronyms that I have to rapidly write down to figure out who the heck you're talking about. But I guess that all is by way of saying you're an outlier. So I still need to know, you've been in this business for quite some time now. You've consulted and advised with I don't know how many entities. What kind of person can be successful in a world of cybersecurity? And here's what I'm thinking about. The CIO, yes, the CTO, and also the chief security officer. What do these poor souls come with in terms of experience that helps them to be successful?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the nice comments. I would be delighted to think I had a sense of humor. And I think maintaining a sense of humor is pretty important, especially if you do something like cybersecurity, where you know you're going to lose more or less every day something. And so I appreciate that. I would say in my own life, it's probably been very helpful that I am a lawyer and I was not trained in cybersecurity. I wasn't trained in technology. And so I have had to learn it every step of the way. And that has probably added to my own humility, because I am around people who can talk in technical jargon and they can talk in acronyms and they understand the abbreviations they're using. And I'm the one who's constantly having to say, wait a minute, would you just explain that to me? What is that? And so if that has helped make me more sensitive to other people, I would be delighted to think that. But it's only because I've lived through that myself. And I would just say one other point on this, and I think gets to your bigger question, which is, we're really good at building mousetraps. We're really bad at getting people to use them. And so at the end of the day, although technology is really important here, and I can go on and on about how I admire technologists, technology is not going to solve this problem. This is a question of incentives and understanding human behavior and organizational behavior and how we nudge people to get the behavior we want or to stop the behaviors we don't want. And I think that is that really requires being able to communicate with them. That requires not. And so one thing that we're seeing is companies now are hiring more lawyers and MBAs and non-technology people as their CIOs, because you can have the best technical CIO in the world, but if she can't communicate with the board or can't communicate with the shareholders or can't communicate with the employees, that's going to be useless. And so you certainly need technical experts, but you also need people who understand the broader policy environment, who understand that perfect solutions are often not workable solutions. Like, I can secure your computer, just turn it off. It will be absolutely secure. I won't have to worry about it at all. But that's not going to be useful to you. So then trying to work with you to understand what do you need operationally and how can we make that as secure as possible in light of those needs? It's more the work of the social sciences, to be honest, rather than the computer sciences.
That PhD that I earned in political science 1,000 years ago, it really wasn't for naught. There's hope.
It may be the key degree, because this is all politics, even if you're just lowercase p, learning how to navigate budget, power, control, head count. These are all critical tools of the CIO or the CISO.
Professor Cate, it's a pleasure for you to take some of your time today to talk to us. And I wish you the very, very best and continue that great sense of humor. We need it in these times.
Well, I'm honored to have the chance. Thank you so much, and good luck.
Thank you for listening to Innovators, a production of Harris Search Associates. We'll have more insightful conversations with global thought leaders to follow.